For many people, mentioning the Cold War quickly conjures images of nuclear weapons, the Berlin Wall, and maybe comparing Coke to Kvass. What may not come so readily to mind, however, are aircraft hijackings and bombs in discos or on buses, and yet these were a persistent, albeit somewhat low-key feature of the period. When we talk about terrorism, most people's minds go to the tragedy of 9/11 or 7/7, or perhaps more recent tragic events. Yet international terrorism, despite becoming a more pressing threat after the 1990s, is nothing new in history and played a wide and varied role between 1945 and 1991. I'm your host David, and today we are going to give an introduction to the role of international terrorism during the Cold War. First, a quick disclaimer, which should be unnecessary, but sometimes people are weird, so I'm gonna say it anyway. Terrorism, whatever its motivation, is a tactic designed to spread terror, mainly among the civilian population. We at the Cold War Channel denounce terrorism in the strongest terms as a strategy of the weak and of the cowardly. Our video today is designed to explain the emergence of modern terrorism in the context of the Cold War, and is not in any way an endorsement of the strategy or any group, past or present, who has utilized it. Additionally, we will, when possible, be avoiding using the names of terrorism perpetrators, as you will see what all terrorists desire is notoriety, therefore we will endeavor to keep the focus on their victims. Okay, terrorism is broadly defined as the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to inculcate fear. Terrorism is intended to coerce or intimidate governments or societies in the pursuit of goals that are generally political, religious, or ideological. And terrorism has been a facet of human society for millennia. In Roman-occupied Judea, fanatics known as the Sicarii would attack Romans and Jewish collaborators in public places before killing themselves to prevent capture. In the modern era, however, terrorism is closely linked with the rise of ideas of anarchism and socialism, which began to take root in the late 19th century. Italian socialist Carlo Piasecane in 1957 became an advocate of propaganda by the deed. Subsequently, violent radicals across the world engaged in the assassination of leaders and officials with the goal of sparking class revolution. There were many attempts on government officials, business leaders, and heads of state. Victims of successful assassinations include, but are certainly not limited to, Tsar Alexander II, who was killed by a suicide bomber from the radical group People's Will in 1881, Umberto I, King of Italy, who was shot by an anarchist in 1900, and US President William McKinley, who was shot by a different anarchist in 1901. Of course, the most prominent victim of terrorist violence of the 20th century was Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whose murder eventually sparked the First World War. These attacks are often regarded as precursors to modern terrorism because they were transnational in scope and motivated by utopian political ideals rather than narrow nationalistic calls. After the First World War, politically motivated violence continued, but usually was confined to single nations as radical communist, fascist, and other political groups battled for control. Terrorism as a tactic emerged during the anti-colonial conflicts of the 1950s and 60s, again though this was primarily carried out by nationalistic groups and were a facet of broader guerrilla warfare. Examples include the King David Hotel bombing by the radical Zionist group Irgun, or the so-called Battle of Algiers in 1956 and 1957, when Algerian nationalists carried out a series of bombings and murders in Algiers against the French colonial regime. These attacks were part of a broader and often complex narrative around decolonization. Groups like Irgun and the Algerian FLN were primarily nationalistic in character, and thus their scope of action was more limited from the broader Cold War conflict. This, however, began to change as the Cold War deepened. In 1968, El Al Flight 426 from London to Jerusalem was hijacked by 3 armed men from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, and flown to Algeria. After lengthy negotiations, the hostages were traded for the release of 16 prisoners. The professor, David Rappaport, identified this hijacking as the first act of a new wave of transnational left-wing terrorism. A major part of this reasoning, identifying the incident as a first, is examining the PFLP's stated motivation. While yes, they did advocate the liberation of Palestine, they differed in that they were expressly left-wing in their outlook and called for the overthrow of so-called reactionary regimes across the Arab world. In other words, it wasn't just focused on Palestine. The PFLP set a precedent that was soon adopted by other groups, expressing left-wing liberation ideologies and framing their struggle as part of a broader global struggle for liberation. This was partially done out of genuine conviction, partially out of necessity to gain a degree of legitimacy and recognition. While neither of the superpowers directly financed or organized terrorism, as far as we're aware, they both supported proxies who, through their own foreign policies, directly or indirectly supported these terrorist acts. The largest and most transnational were the myriad of groups associated with the liberation of Palestine. The USSR funded and sold arms to Arab states who directly or indirectly supported a myriad of pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli groups. These groups carried out scores of attacks, the most notable being aircraft hijackings, to the point that between 1968 and 1972, there was an average of one hijacking every 5 days. Not all of these were terrorism-related or related to pro-Palestinian causes. Indeed, a number of hijackings were carried out by Latin American or American dissidents, along with people with purely criminal motives, including the notorious D.B. Cooper. We should also point out here that hijackings during the Cold War were very different from those that unfolded during 9/11. The objective of most hijackers was the release of people they perceived to be political prisoners. Hijacking an aircraft gave the perpetrators hostages and demanded that they would be taken seriously. Landing in a country sympathetic to their cause also served to make successful mediation more likely. Hijackings declined throughout the 1980s and 1990s as nations increasingly recognized hijacking as a collective threat, and increased airport screening made smuggling weapons aboard more difficult. Various governments also began to train military and police units which specialized in counterterrorism and hostage rescue. One notable example of this was Operation Thunderbolt in 1976, also known as the Battle of Entebbe. After an Air France flight flying from Paris to Tel Aviv was hijacked and made to fly first to Libya and then to Uganda, Israeli commandos managed to rescue 102 of 106 hostages held by PLO-aligned operatives who had the active support of Ugandan dictator Idi Amin. The situation in Entebbe was a microcosm of the dynamics of Cold War terrorism. Idi Amin, a head of state who had come to power in a military coup, utilized global liberation ideology to support groups like the PLO and force concessions from the West. Other heads of state who practiced this included Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Gaddafi actively supplied weapons to numerous groups and hosted terrorist training camps in the Libyan desert. Also present at Entebbe were two members of the far-left Revolutionäre Zellen, or Revolutionary Cells, one of a number of far-left groups active in Western Europe, for whom support of Palestine was secondary to the overthrow of the West German government. Western revolutionary groups were numerous and ran the gambit from the Weather Underground in the United States, a supposedly communist organization who advocated revolution in the US, to the Red Army faction in Germany, who also tried to start a communist revolution there. Despite having similar goals, the groups varied in tactics. The Weather Underground used bombings, but mainly targeted property, while the Red Army faction bombed buildings with minimal warning and deployed kidnapping and assassination. These two examples, along with numerous others that we don't have time to go into today, grew out of the radical fringe of broader social movements. Few ever numbered more than 20 to 40 adherents, but despite their small size, they created violence and chaos, and when successful, mobilized the full efforts of their national governments against them. Weather Underground and Red Army faction are of course only two examples. There were also the Red Brigades in Italy, the Action Directe in France, and numerous others. One of the most well-known Cold War terror groups, and one of the most controversial, was the Irish Republican Army, or more specifically, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, a militant group which used violence to try to bring about a reunification of Northern Ireland with the Republic of Ireland, or at the very least achieve equal civil rights for Irish Catholics in the region which had long been politically dominated by Protestants. The IRA trained with the Libyan army and received weapons and explosives from Gaddafi throughout the 1960s and 70s, with the majority not laying down arms until the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. The so-called Troubles in Northern Ireland illustrated how terrorism and violence can be a means of negotiation. During intermediate talks between militants and authorities, it was established the IRA would issue bomb threats with recognized code words to tell authorities the threat was genuine and not a hoax. This approach helped to minimize the blowback of civilian casualties. One prominent example of this in practice was the 1996 Manchester bombing, when the IRA detonated a 1,500-kilo lorry bomb in the Manchester city centre, injuring 212 people, but with very few serious casualties, a result of the code word threat and subsequent evacuation. Of course, this code word practice did not always work. That's what happened during the 1998 Omagh bombing, when a lack of specificity in the location of the bomb inadvertently resulted in people being evacuated into the bomb area, resulting in 29 dead and hundreds injured. Now, the Troubles help illustrate many of the complex dynamics faced in terrorism, because while the IRA targeted the British state, they also fought with unionist paramilitary groups who used their own terrorist tactics, including bombings and assassinations. That's right, both sides employed terrorist tactics. And Northern Ireland was not the only example of this. If we return to the Algerian War of Independence, we see the FLN campaign provoking a right-wing terrorist response within the French metropole, designed to force France to keep the colony. The Organisation Armée Secrète, the Secret Army Organization, or OAS, although only acting for roughly a year from 1961 to 1962, may have caused up to 2,000 deaths. Its successor, the Charles Martel Group, a radical right-wing anti-immigrant group, was active until the 1980s and plagued France with numerous murders and bombings. Just how left-wing terrorism was largely based around ideals of global liberation, but drew from the radical fringes, right-wing terrorism grew out of the fringes of reactionary ideals. In many cases, this led to right-wing terrorists explicitly emulating the rhetoric and ideals of Nazism. Although adapted to national circumstances, groups like Nuclei Armati Rivoluzionari in Italy, Deutsche Aktiongruppe in Germany, and the Order in the United States carried out a variety of attacks against those they perceived to be left-wing sympathizers, or their supposed racial enemies. The objectives of these groups varied from countering their supposed racial or sectarian enemies, as was the case in Northern Ireland, to attacking immigrants, to trying to found a white ethno-state within their own country. Now, most of these groups had little in the way of international validation and support. Indeed, while their ideology passed within their like-minded circles, an example of this would be the American notions of sovereign citizens, which is an extremely convoluted ideology passed to German far-right groups, leading to the emergence of the Reichsbürger movement. And believe it or not, far-right groups also struggled with infiltration from law enforcement. In 1987, the US government launched a failed prosecution against 14 white supremacists for sedition in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Although the jury acquitted the defendants, in the course of the trial it became apparent that most of the members of the supposed conspiracy were in fact informants or undercover agents from multiple law enforcement agencies. This led to a dramatic shift in far-right strategy. Rather than try to build cohesive organizations, far-right groups, initially in the US but later internationally, began to adopt a model of terrorism known as leaderless resistance. Under this model, above-ground organizations would publish far-right ideals, relying on free speech protections as a shield, and then celebrate individuals who carried out attacks, while also helping to disseminate instructions on how to carry out attacks which could also spread underground. The concept was conceived using magazines, zines, and pamphlets, but as it turned out, the proliferation of the internet in the 1990s and 2000s would help to supercharge this model of terrorism. One of the most notable examples of leaderless resistance was the Oklahoma City bombing of 1993, which killed 168 and injured up to 759 people. The bomber, who acted largely alone, was inspired by a 1975 novel, The Turner Diaries, which told a fictional account of a white insurgency in the United States to overthrow the government. Breaking our timeline here somewhat, other examples of leaderless resistance can be seen in the 2011 attack in Norway and the 2019 Christchurch attack, both carried out by lone, far-right radicals with the objective of killing as many innocent people as possible. Violence ultimately begets violence, and although terrorist violence in the Cold War was often tempered and restrained by the need to maintain official support or sympathy from various nations or populations, over time terrorism became less restrained and more violent. In the United States, the Black Liberation Army carried out numerous murders, mainly of police officers, and the so-called Symbionese Liberation Army famously and infamously kidnapped newspaper heiress Patty Hearst, who, due to Stockholm Syndrome or other factors, even participated in their violent armed robberies. The BLA and Symbionese in many ways represented the last gasp of left-wing terrorism, at least in the US. But even as the USSR began to crumble, and with it the incentive for nations like Libya to support global liberation movements in exchange for Soviet largesse, or to restrain their proxies in exchange for US concessions, waned. At the same time, however, the prolonged war in Afghanistan gave rise to a new type of movement, one that claimed to wage holy war in the name of returning their religion to the original time of their prophet. After the Soviet invasion in 1979, Afghan resistance was bolstered financially and with weapons by the US through Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Also flocking to the country were young men with illusions of holy war. Among them is one figure who we will have to break our rule of not mentioning terrorist names due to his outside impact, Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden served as a logistics coordinator and facilitator to funnel Islamic fighters into Afghanistan throughout the 1980s. There's never been any evidence he was directly in contact with US intelligence, but the US and its allies were aware of his existence and largely treated the would-be holy warriors as a nuisance, sure that they would go home once the war was over. Bin Laden, however, exploited the power vacuum in Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal in order to buy protection for himself and his new organization, Al-Qaeda. Drawing on the same financial network he had used to support combating the Soviets to now fund his organization, Bin Laden essentially bought protection from the Taliban and set up a series of training camps designed to train operatives to help carry out terrorist actions under the guise of jihad or holy war around the world. In 1990, the US, with the consent of the USSR and the UN Security Council, deployed troops in Saudi Arabia to protect it from Iraq, which had illegally annexed the neighboring state of Kuwait. Bin Laden, offended at the idea of infidel soldiers being on the holy soil of Saudi Arabia, declared jihad against the United States. Al-Qaeda supported Somali warlords in their attacks on US troops in 1993, that's the Battle of Mogadishu and Black Hawk Down, for those who may not know. They were also involved in the bombings of US embassies in East Africa in 1998, as well as the subsequent targeting of the warship USS Cole in Yemen in 2000. Bin Laden and his associates were a new breed of terrorists throughout the Cold War. Global liberationists like the PLO and the IRA had a clear political objective in mind and thus needed to restrain their violence. The emergence of jihadists, similar to their neo-Nazi compatriots, believed in a world that was pure fantasy, but because of their delusions, they did not seek to just kill innocents, but to kill as many as possible by whatever means were available. Thus, when hijackers seized control of 4 aircraft on September 11, 2001, most of the crew initially tried to keep the passengers calm and to cooperate, sure that the hijackers would seek to land and begin negotiations, because that's what hijackers had always done. At some point, however, the truth was filtered through mobile phones to the passengers of United 93, who grasped that this was different and attempted to retake control of the aircraft. In doing so, they most likely saved many innocent lives at the cost of their own. So this has been an extremely broad overview of terrorism during the Cold War, designed to give a framework of understanding of how it fit into a Cold War context. We hope to make more videos on this topic in the future, with closer examinations of very specific groups, or perhaps methodologies, depending on the level of interest expressed by yourselves, the viewer. Let us know in the comments what you think. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is sitting on a plane demanding the release of the 7 members of the new Provo Front, the 5 leaders of Liberté de Quebec, and the 9 members of the Asian Dawn Movement. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.